Do it. Welcome to the Church of Mabus radio show. It's Friday night. It's 7:06 p.m. Central. You listen to United Public Radio 107.7 FM New Orleans. And check out Dead Sky Publishing. They have some guests coming up. They just had Chad Lutsky on. They do some great Weird West splatter Western books. We've been on a Weird West kick, and they have some guests coming up in November that do these Weird West books from deadskypublishing.com. So check that out. And let's see here. We got Jay with us tonight.
What's going on, Jeff? How's your weather today?
It's humid,
we're getting cold up here.
It's humid, but it actually has been hitting 40s down, 49 and stuff. So
that's good.
And that's early for here, so that's going to tell you what the winter is going to be like. Probably
the ice age has begun.
We got Mark Dawidziak with us tonight. Mystery of Mysteries: The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe. It's great to have you here. What a great subject! I've loved Poe since since I was a child, and still do. Definitely perfect for this season. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine now, and something we have in common then, because Poe is an author I've carried through my entire life as well. So, I don't know how old you were when you read your first Poe story, but I'm going to guess, because most people get Poe around the 7th grade for the first time. That's about the time in school you get The Telltale Heart and The Raven, and that's a great age to get it, but horror fans tend to get Poe a little earlier. So I'm going to guess you were probably a little bit younger than the 7th grade. It
was probably 6th or 7th grade. I remember reading Stephen King in 6th grade, so it was, there was some weird books. And I remember A Clockwork Orange. I don't know. I don't think my school gave that to me, but I swear I don't think that was ever in a school curriculum, was it?
It was for me in 9th grade. They made us read that. And
I thought so. So it must have been.
But and it's extremely violent, and and it's got some weird words in it, especially the Euro speak that they talk. And I'm dyslexic, so I couldn't get the book. It was just so hard to even rifle through it. So my mom helped me cheat. We rented the movie and watched the movie.
Oh my God! How old were you? Were you traumatized?
No, it's a hard book. It's a hard book.
How old were you though to watch the movie? Is what I was asking. How old were you?
13. How old are you in 9th grade? 12, 13 years old.
I don't remember.
That's a little young. That's a little young for Clockwork Orange. It's a little.
Yeah, it's an extremely violent book.
Yeah. There was just some story about some teacher showing his kids that weird Winnie the Pooh horror movie, like in a very low grade.
God.
That's like
I don't even want to see it. I don't want to see it. I saw the little
I haven't.
picture window on Roku, and it's like, ugh.
Yeah, I haven't. Well, Mark, I know I've seen The Pale Blue Eye, and there's a Raven's Hollow Edgar Allan Poe horror movie. I haven't seen Raven's Hollow yet, but I enjoyed The Pale Blue Eye. But what do we know about the military stuff? Because those movies seem to kind of embellish when he's in that. And I'm sure they take liberties. I'm sure, but
everybody's always taking liberties. I mean, you go all the way back to the 1930s, and the films with Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi called The Black Cat, The Raven, and they've got very little to do with Poe. And then you get to the Roger Corman cycle, and they too. They might use a little germ of an idea of what Poe wrote about. People not staying true to Poe, both his writing and his personality, is sort of the standard in all things. The films mostly present Poe the way he is perceived in the popular culture, and that's the stereotype of Poe. We have created a caricature of Poe, and it's a fun caricature. It really is. I mean, we've made of him our grandfather of goth, our titan of terror, our sultan of the supernatural. He is that guy to us, and that's because we've made him that. And he's the guy we put on, coffee mugs. We put his image on T-shirts. We've made plushies of him. We make action figures of him. Yes. We do all these things. We create this kind of funhouse version of Poe because it's fun, and we like that Poe, and that's great. But that's not who he was. He wasn't anything like that. And the pop culture and a lot of people in his time after he died, they sort of created a fictional Poe, and it's the fictional Poe that shows up in the movies and in all the drawings and in all of the iconic stuff that we create for Poe. Um, and the military is an interesting part of his life because he joins the military after he leaves Richmond, after he has a break with his foster father, and he goes to Boston, and he still very young, and he publishes his first volume of poetry while he's in Boston, and then he joins the army under an alias, Edgar Perry, and he is sent to Fort Moultrie. He is sent to South Carolina, and he serves at this area, and he's a good soldier. He's actually a very good soldier. He gets rapidly promoted to as far as he could go. He goes all the way to sergeant as a soldier. And as an adult, after he leaves the service, he never loses that kind of military gait. We always think of Poe walking slump-shouldered and all around with a cloak around him and sallow eyes. And
I'm so goth.
And that's not who Poe was. Poe walked briskly, and he was athletic. Do we think of Poe as athletic? Does anybody think of Poe as athletic? But Poe was an excellent boxer, an excellent long-distance swimmer. He had excellent. He could win any jumping or leaping contest, and he walked everywhere. He was really, for the most part of his life, pretty healthy. The last couple of years, he only lived to be 40, and the last couple of years, his health starts to go off the track. But that military bearing that he got, he never kind of lost it. So if you met Poe on the streets of Philadelphia, say in 1843, you would have met a guy who had no mustache, sideburns, handsome, and high hairline, big forehead, and a healthy, robust guy. And again, we don't think of Poe in that way at all. But that's who the real person was. That's the real person who wrote all those stories. And then after he gets out of the army, he lobbies to get accepted into West Point. So he goes to West Point. He's only at West Point for like a couple months. He's not there very long because his foster father is not sending him enough money to support his studies there. And there's a final break with his foster father at this point. And he also has discovered the rigors of West Point. West Point today is no picnic. If you're a cadet at West Point, back then it was 100 times more severe. The dropout rate at West Point was not uncommon for cadets to drop out in the first year because there was a whole set of rules you were given, and all the rules were things you couldn't do. And among them was you couldn't play cards. You couldn't read at night for fun. That was considered corrupting. Everything was about you got up, you drilled, you had breakfast, you drilled some more, you went to classes, you drilled some more, you had lunch, you drilled some more, you went to classes. That was your life at West Point. And it was a very, very, Spartan existence. So the one thing Poe learned how to do when he was at West Point was that he and his roommate became expert at sneaking off campus and getting a jug of booze and bringing it back to the dormitory. And then everybody would come by their room for a slug of something every once in a while. And in order to do that, one of you had to be the lookout to look out for the guard, and the other was the runner who would go down to the local pub, restaurant, and come back with a jug. So he got very good at that. But, he conspired to have himself court-martialed at the end of just a little while at West Point. And, he stopped going to classes. He stopped going to chapel. You had to go to chapel. That was one of the things you had to go. If you didn't, you got demerits. And once you got enough demerits, you were a candidate for being court-martialed. So Poe has himself court-martialed, and that's it. I mean, that's his military career. Fort Moultrie, sergeant, West Point, and that's the extent of his military training and career.
And what happened with the court-martial?
It was a formality. He wasn't even there. He left. He basically and then was told later that the court-martial went through. It was just a formality. It was a rubber stamping. It wasn't. There was no punishment. It was a student leaving. It was nothing more than that.
And what did he do after that? I mean, what was his?
Well, after he leaves, it's almost more important to sort of go the other way first.
Okay.
And to see where he was before he goes into the service because Edgar Allan Poe was born in Boston. Now, most people do not associate Boston with Edgar Allan Poe, but his mother was an actress, Eliza Poe, and she was a very good actress. She was back then being an actress in America was a very tough life. First off, it's not like acting today. If you went to a city and you, as a part of a theater company, and you set up in a theater, you didn't just do one play and were there for like 2-3 weeks. The theater going audience wasn't that big in any American city back in the early 1800s. So you had to offer something different every single night you were there. They were expecting something new every night. So one night you might be doing Shakespeare, the next night you're doing a farce, the next night you're doing a melodrama, the next night you're doing a comedy. You had to be good at a lot of things, and Eliza Poe was very good at a lot of things. She could sing beautifully. She was an elegant dancer. She could do comedy. She could do farce. She could do Shakespeare, and she could commit an immense number of roles to memory. She had at her fingertips the ability to do a staggering number of roles. And when you weren't acting, you were expected to be taking tickets or moving sets. And you were also constantly moving from city to city where something was raging that could kill you almost any time of year. It might have been cholera. It might have been yellow fever. It might have been tuberculosis, everywhere, which was everywhere at the time. So Eliza Poe only lives to be 24 years old. Edgar is not yet 3 when she dies. He's orphaned. His father was also an actor, and he died about the same time. So Poe's orphaned, and he's taken in by the Allan family of Richmond, Virginia. And it is from them we get the Allan of Edgar Allan Poe. And John Allan, who is a very stern, austere Scotsman, who sort of believed in people being self-made men, and he wasn't. He doesn't get wealthy until a wealthy uncle of his dies and he inherits it all. He always treats Poe as sort of a charity case. He never formally adopts Poe. He's always a foster child, so Poe is never fully accepted. And Poe is constantly losing women. He's always constantly losing women who love him and care for him. He loses his mother before he's 3. Frances Allan, John Allan's wife, who seemed to love him and wanted, she dies young. The mother of one of his best friends, who seems to understand him and becomes so the surrogate mother for him in Richmond, she dies. So he's constantly losing women. So he finally breaks with his father, with his foster father. And John Allan, by the way, he does die a fabulously wealthy man. When he does die, he leaves money to illegitimate children. He leaves not a dime to Edgar Allan Poe. Nothing. So Poe leaves the West Point. He's destitute. He has no money. He's got no prospects. He goes to New York first, and then he ends up in Baltimore. And he goes to because the Poe family was from Baltimore. And he goes to the home of his aunt, Maria Clem, who everybody called Muddy. And it is here in this house that he gets the first sort of semblance of a real family. And she's going to become a surrogate mother to him. And she has a daughter, Virginia. And Poe eventually gets a job in Richmond, Virginia, as the literary critic and editor of the Southern Literary Messenger. And it's during this time he makes a bid to marry Virginia. Now, this is the part of the story that there's no way that a modern audience doesn't hear this and it doesn't sound, for lack of a better word, icky. Okay. Virginia is his first cousin, and she's 13 years old. So this is kind of Jerry Lee Lewis territory right now. You know, he's going to marry his first cousin. Now, back then, child brides were not uncommon, and marrying your first cousin was not uncommon, especially among the aristocracy. But you say this today and people hear it and they go, ew, well, for whatever else it was, this was a very happy marriage and a very happy household. Because remember, his aunt is now going to become his mother-in-law. And she lives with them. And the 3 of them become a very happy household. She approves. The Poes are very happy. He teaches her music and gives her lessons. They play duets together. He plays the flute. She has a beautiful singing voice. And it's a very happy household. And here he gets this sense of being fully accepted as a person. And for a while he has this. until Virginia dies of tuberculosis in 1845. And then Poe sort of goes off the tracks and off the rails. And the last few years of his life are kind of a desperate bid to find love. And it eventually ends with him dying in October of 1849. So that's kind of the short, Poe's life is defined by 5 American cities: Boston, where he's born; Richmond, where he grows up and where he makes his literary reputation later on; Baltimore, where he finds his family; Philadelphia, where he has his peak years from 1838 to 1844, and he produces most of his great stories during this period; New York, where he moves into a cottage and is living at the time of his death. And those 5 cities sort of are the framework for Poe's life.
Definitely. I'm like seeing it in my head and living it like a movie and seeing his character, his face and everything. But yeah, definitely. And a lot of diseases and things like that. And God, coming up in the orphan, that's hard. I'm sure no matter what time zone you're in or what year.
Geographically, Poe's life is defined by those 5 cities. Emotionally, his life is defined by loss. He's just constantly losing people throughout his life. And that's not uncommon. I mean, death was much more up close and personal back then, and there was a lot of child death.
I think the average age people lived to in the 1800s was around 35, 40 years old, if you were lucky.
Well, you did have some long livers, but yes, you had a lot dragging that down, and not the least of which was the fact that there's no knowledge of germs, there's no knowledge of transmission of germs. Practically everybody probably was contaminated with tuberculosis back then because it's an airborne disease. Everybody's in very close contact with each other, and a staggering number of people probably were carrying around. There might have been an active case, but practically a staggering percentage of the population was contaminated in some way with tuberculosis. So yeah, it is. It is a period where, but throughout all this, and it's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because if you look at the book, the subtitle, the main title of the book is A Mystery of Mysteries, which comes from one of Poe's best poems, a lesser known poem. It's not as well known as, say, The Raven or Annabel Lee, but it's certainly one of my favorite of his poems. It's called Spirits of the Dead. And he wrote it while he was still very young, a teenager. And it kind of eerily predicts a lot of what's going to come in his life, the spirits of the dead. And the last line of the poem is the title of the book, A Mystery of Mysteries. And the subtitle is The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe. Now that's reversed from what you expect it to be. The standard biography, it's supposed to be the life and death of fill in the blank. I reversed it, and I reversed it for a lot of reasons, not the least of which was any discussion of Edgar Allan Poe always seems to start with the mystery of his death, which is kind of interesting, that, most biographies start logically where life starts, when somebody is born. And yet with Poe, we always seem to start at the end. We always seem to start in those mysterious last days. And I think one of the reasons is because Poe has one of the great literary stage exits of all time, if not the greatest, if not the greatest single. There are 3 great literary stage exits in literary history. The first is Moliere, because Moliere is a French playwright and an actor. He's not just a playwright, he's also an actor. And, he appears in plays that he has written. So Moliere, they're premiering his last play, and he's dying. He's dying of tuberculosis. So he's appearing on stage, and he's in his death throes, basically. And he collapses on stage. And they drag him into the wings, and they revive him, and they push him back out on stage. He goes back out on stage, and he finishes the play. And then he goes home and he dies.
Wow.
That is just a great stage exit for somebody who's both a playwright and an actor. And the second great stage exit is Mark Twain. Because Twain is born on November 30th, 1835, with Halley's Comet visible in the night sky overhead. And a year before he dies, Twain correctly predicts he will die when the comet comes back in April of 1910. And he pulls it off. He actually pulls it off. He tells an audience in 1909, the Almighty has said, no doubt, that there are these two indefinable freaks, Halley's Comet and me. They came in together. They must go out together. And he told the audience, I'm looking forward to that. And that's exactly what happens. He comes in with the comet. He goes out with the comet. And that's a little detail that would not be out of place in Greek myth about a hero born with a comet and dying with the same comet coming back. Mm-hmm. That's pretty good. But Poe dies under circumstances which reflect his two greatest literary achievements. Poe is the father of the modern detective story. He creates the role model for Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot and every super sleuth that's going to follow. He creates the character of Master Detective C. Auguste Dupin. And Dupin is in three short stories that Poe wrote: Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Mystery of Marie Roget, and The Purloined Letter, which is the best of the three. And that character is the role model, direct role model for Sherlock Holmes. How do we know that? Because Arthur Conan Doyle told us that.
Oh, gosh.
Conan Doyle comes to America after the Holmes stories have become a sensation. And he's at a press conference, and the room is full of American reporters, and they think they're going to get him. And they say, well, didn't you just steal your Sherlock Holmes from Poe's Dupin? And Doyle says, yep, absolutely. That's exactly what I did, you know. And he gives Poe full credit for inventing this. And then in 1909, on the 100th anniversary of Poe's birth, there is a dinner in London attended by a banquet full of authors. And Conan Doyle gives the keynote address that night. And he says, where was the mystery story before Poe breathed life into it? So Poe is the acknowledged father of the modern mystery detective story. And he leaves us with a mystery. He leaves us not with a mystery, but a double-barreled mystery, because Poe we have not solved the mystery of how he died. We're up to about 25 theories as to what killed Poe. And it has not been solved one little bit since the day he stopped drawing breath on October 7th, 1849. So he leaves us with a mystery, what killed him. And then he leaves us the second mystery, which is Poe leaves Richmond in late September of 1849. From the moment he puts his foot on a steamer in a dock in Richmond, on a boat heading for Baltimore, for 6 days, a curtain comes down. They are missing days. We have no idea where Poe was and what happened to him during these 6 days until he is found insensible on the streets of Baltimore 6 days later. And nobody has ever stepped forward to say, so much as I passed him on the street, I saw him at the rail of the steamer, I had a meal with him. Nothing. These 6 days are completely shielded from our view. So Poe leaves us with two mysteries. And then he dies under circumstances. He's lingering. He lingers for several days at a Baltimore hospital. He's feverish. He's out of his head. He's raving for part of the time. So he dies under circumstances which would not be out of place in one of his own horror stories. So the father of the modern detective story and the modern horror story dies under circumstances which reflect his two greatest literary achievements. That, my friends, is the greatest literary stage exit of all time. That's almost like a press agent stepped in and said, Eddie, the best thing for you would be to die at 40 under circumstances that are right out of your own stories. Because that's what he does. And that's what happens. And that's why the discussion always seems to start with Poe's death. It always seems like, again, we reverse the order. But another reason I reverse the order is this. One of the few things we know for absolute certainty about Poe's death is that he stopped drawing breath on October 7th, 1849 at a Baltimore hospital. That is beyond dispute. And then we also know that the next day, on October 8th, 1849, He was buried in a small Presbyterian cemetery in Baltimore on a very cold, windy, miserable, overcast day at a ceremony attended by very few people. He is lowered into the grave in a cheap casket with very little ceremony. And then the following day, October 9th, he's buried again. Because what happens on October 9th is somebody he thought was a friend wrote an obituary for a New York newspaper. Turns out this friend, who has the magnificently villainous name of Rufus Griswold, if that doesn't sound like a villain's name, I don't know what does.
Yeah.
It sounds like it's right out of a Victorian melodrama. Somebody with a mustache twirling, Rufus Griswold, going to dispossess the orphans and the widow. Rufus Griswold has been nursing grudges against Poe for years. He's jealous of Poe, and he doesn't wait until the body is cold. When Poe dies, he writes an obituary that starts, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but the essence of it is, Edgar Allan Poe died the day before yesterday in Baltimore. Some will be surprised, few will be grieved. And it went downhill from there. He accuses Poe of being immoral, of being a drunkard. He does damage to Poe's reputation, which has not been undone to this day. All the stereotypes about Poe sort of start here. And is there a backlash to this? Yes, there's a backlash to this. Some of his friends, and he has friends, he has lots of friends, rally and try to fight Griswold, but Griswold's not done. He's going to write more about Poe in the coming years, and he's going to add more and more charges to Poe, doing more and more damage to Poe's reputation. And the biggest backlash comes from the French, led by Baudelaire and his disciples, who idolize Poe. And Baudelaire goes after Griswold. He calls Griswold a pedagogic vampire. He famously asks in one defense of Poe about Griswold and his treatment of the deceased writer, are there not ordinances in your country that prevent dogs from running loose in your cemetery? So he compares Griswold to a dog. So Baudelaire and his disciples are really sort of riding to the rescue in some way, but they also do a lot of damage because they replace one stereotype with another. Because they like the idea of Poe's brilliance being a result of him being touched with some form of insanity. So they now start to encourage readers to confuse Poe with his unreliable narrators. Poe is the guy in The Telltale Heart who is contemplating killing and dismembering the old man with the pale blue eye. Poe is the guy in The Raven talking to the raven. Poe is the guy in The Cask of Amontillado luring the noble Fortunato to his death in the catacombs. All of this is nonsense. Poe was none of those things. He was a very careful writer. He was a very careful and exacting artist. He was healthy most of his life. He was none of the stereotype.
Where did the opium stuff come from? All that stigmata, so to speak, is there was no evidence for that.
Well, first off, let me say there is no proof at all that Poe ever took drugs at all, except what might have been prescribed to him by a physician at the time. Yeah. Poe was later on. Griswold added the charge of drug addict to his other charges of Poe, and even Poe's bitterest enemies. There's some really even greater enemies that he had than even they said. There's no evidence at all that Poe ever took drugs. So complete folly, but it latched on to the stereotype. And so we now the French adding their kind of misinterpretation of Poe. And then the 20th century takes over. And now we get the pop culture, which is a double-edged sword for Poe. It keeps his fame going because you have all these movies and then later television shows and radio shows based on Poe's work. And this small group of stories define Poe for us. And there are the horror stories and the spooky poems. And this small group of stories, this is what we think of Edgar Allan Poe. And so the caricature becomes entrenched in the 20th century. And what is the caricature? The caricature is this. I say Edgar Allan Poe, and you got an image. You've got an image in your mind. And first off, that's great because that's fame. How many writers can you name to the average American and they would get an image of what the writer looked like? Think about it. I mean, could the average American pick Herman Melville out of a police lineup?
No.
You know, would they know what Saul Bellow looked like? But everybody knows Edgar Allan Poe. He's on T-shirts. We make plushies on him. You can go into a Barnes and Noble or a BAM, and you can see shelves of merchandise devoted to Poe.
Yeah.
Where are the shelves for Emerson? Where are the shelves for Thoreau? Why don't we have shelves devoted to them? But Poe, he's everywhere, and it's because of the 1-2 punch of the public school curriculum. Because everybody gets Poe in the 7th grade and then on. So he's constantly being reintroduced. And then you have the pop culture. And Poe's everywhere in the pop culture. He's on the cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album. He's not only on the cover, he's got the top center position. He's name-checked in songs by John Lennon and Bob Dylan. Stories have been given playful twists on everything from The Simpsons to SpongeBob SquarePants. He's
Funko Pops.
he's summoned as a character on South Park and
Yep.
the 21st century. Right now, we have a series starting in Netflix, the House of Usher series, which
That's
is
next
based
on my
his
list.
characters, and the Wednesday series, which seems to mention Poe all the time. And then we've had movies like The Pale Blue Eye and The Raven. So Poe is the two most recognized American authors, without question, are Mark Twain and Edgar Allan Poe.
Hey,
Well, and I think there's also sort of an archetype to his face in that main picture that's all over the place with the curly sideburns and the curly locks. If you were to look at a silhouette of his face or his head, Einstein's, Freud's, and Mark Twain's silhouettes, you probably couldn't tell them apart. They seem to be an archetype, those 4 or 5 gentlemen. They have very similar looking hairstyles. They'll have, later on, like you said, Poe didn't have the mustache, early on, but the iconographic photograph of him is with that big bushy mustache.
Well,
but he kind of,
another thing that's the stereotype.
Like Einstein, he looks to me like Sigmund Freud, and these 4 men look a lot alike together.
Well, it's one more thing that has fed the stereotype. You see, there's only 6 or 7 known photographs of Poe. They're called daguerreotypes, and almost all of them come from the last 2 years of his life when he was starting to be sick. So there are portraits of Poe, watercolor portraits, which are done. We've got 6 or 7 photographs, and then 3 or 4 portraits of Poe, which were done in his lifetime. So we have maybe 10 or 11 images of Poe. That's it. That's all we know of what Poe looked like, and they all come from 1843 to 1849, the last 6 years of his life.
Mm-hmm.
And the majority of them are the last 2 years. The majority of the photographic evidence comes to the last 2 years. When he is sick, when he is starting to, when he's looking a little puffy, when he is looking more and more, and he grows the mustache. But in 1843, there's a watercolor of a very handsome man with sideburns and no mustache, and he looks like a leading man. It's Poe. You'd never recognize him. If you passed him on the streets of Philadelphia at that time, you would never recognize it as the Edgar Allan Poe we know today. But those photographs from the end have reinforced the idea of a sickly, sallow guy. This is the stereotype. A guy who's sickly, pale-skinned, sunken eyes, hunched shoulders, sitting up in an attic somewhere, hunched over a manuscript, surrounded by cobwebs and dust, a raven perched on his shoulder, a red-eyed black cat prowling amongst the dust, while he holds a quill pen and spins out his tales of terror in fever dreams fueled by drugs and possibly alcohol and a bottle of cognac within hand's reach. And guys, none of that's true. Not any part of that is true. Not one part of that is who Edgar Allan Poe actually was and how he worked. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. It's also the reasons I reversed the subtitle and made it The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe, because this guy keeps getting buried. He's buried for real. In 1875, they dug him up and buried him again.
What?
In 1875, Baltimore was thinking, well, maybe this Edgar Allan Poe was somebody we should have been paying more attention to. So they decided to put a big monument over his grave. Problem was, in the little part of the cemetery where they had buried him, there wasn't room for a monument. So they had to move him. So they dug him up and buried him again. And then they put this monument over him. And then he gets buried in the 20th century under all this myth and misinformation. And he keeps getting buried. But what's the one thing we really do know from Edgar Allan Poe's short story? It's this. Nothing ever stays buried in an Edgar Allan Poe short story. And Poe ain't going to stay buried. He's going to come zooming out of the grave triumphant. He is going to become the best known, best read American writer, and he's going to outlast and outshine all of those writers who are supposed to outlast and outshine him. He has the best afterlife of any author. Yes, he's defined. It's those small group of stories that have done it. And that's what his again, it's a double-edged sword because they have made his fame and they continue to make his fame. But it is a stereotype.
It sounds like Griswold's campaign against Poe did exactly the opposite.
You're absolutely right. It backfired. It turned him into a villain. It turned him into one of literary history's great villains. That's a very shrewd point, Jay. That's exactly right. And it also made Poe seem more romantic by giving him all of this stuff. Like, I don't want to minimize Poe's faults, but one of the things I wanted to do with the book was to give the real artist. You see, one of the reasons I thought that our concept of Poe had to be wrong was this. I was a journalist for 43 years, and during those 43 years, I got to interview almost every leading person who created horror in some way. Writers like Stephen King and Anne Rice and Clive Barker and Ray Bradbury and Richard Matheson and Robert Bloch. Directors like Wes Craven and John Carpenter, and actors like Vincent Price and Robert Englund. And there's one thing that they all have in common. Every single one of them had a great sense of humor. Every single one. And when I pointed this out to Stephen King, he said, well, of course, it's standard issue for anybody who does horror to have a great sense of humor because you'd go crazy if you didn't have a great sense of humor and you did this. You need it to keep yourself balanced, to keep yourself centered. And horror writers tend to be very, very funny people. Well, if that was true of all these people, then doesn't it follow that Poe must have had a great sense of humor?
Yeah.
And it turns out, guess what? He did. Would it surprise you to know that Poe wrote as much humor as he did horror? We just don't read the humor today, but he wrote a lot of hoaxes, satires, humorous pieces. He was a very witty guy. He was witty, charming. He was a Southern gentleman. He was raised to be a Southern aristocrat. So we don't think of Poe as a comedy writer, but he had a great sense. Even the horror stories are very funny. There are aspects of the horror story. Take a story like Cask of Amontillado, which is basically, it's a very grim story. It's a story about planned death and one person luring another person to his death based on revenge. And yet, it's very funny in places because the narrator, Montresor, has planned to kill Fortunato by using his own vanities against him. And he lures him into the catacombs under Montresor's house where his family's been buried over the years. All because he's purported to have bought a cask of Amontillado wine and he wants his opinion on it. And Fortunato is sick. He keeps coughing. And Montresor is playing with him like with a mouse. He keeps saying, no, let's go back. You're sick and I can't be responsible. You will be ill, and you're a man to be missed. You're an important man. And Fortunato keeps saying, no, it's nothing. It's nothing. We must go on. And he keeps giving him a chance to go back. And he's luring him to his death at the same time. And it finally reaches a point where Fortunato has a coughing fit, and he can't stop coughing. And Montresor says, enough. We must go back. Your health is precious. We must go back. And Fortunato says, enough, enough. It is nothing. It is a mere cough. I shall not die of a cough. And Poe lets that linger in the air just long enough, and then he has Montresor say one word. True. You won't die of a cough. You're about to die under the most horrible circumstances. He's going to be hauled up in the family crypt. That's a laugh line. And Poe's letting you in on the joke. And this is what I mean. Poe had a great sense of humor. And we don't attribute it to him, but this is the real guy who wrote all those stories. This is why he was so great at it. He was great at it not because he was insane. He was great at it because he was in total control of his art. And he was a very careful writer. Was alcohol a problem for Edgar Allan Poe? Yes, but it probably was not the problem you think it is. The record is very clear. From the earliest times that he takes a drink, which was when he was a student at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, every evidence right on to the end of his life is consistent. It took very little alcohol to get Edgar Allan Poe roaring drunk. One drink, and it had been like he'd been drinking for hours. And Poe was not the type to sip or savor a drink.
That's how I am. I don't drink that much, but that's the same. That's
well,
it.
Poe was allergic to it. Poe threw it back, and then he was not only roaring drunk, it took him days to get over it. It wasn't just the case of a simple morning hangover for Poe. It so devastated his system, it took him days to get being bedridden to get over this. But between that, there are these very long periods of sobriety. 12, 14 months when he doesn't touch alcohol. Poe's problem was he always picked the wrong time to drink. It was always the time when it was going to do his reputation the most damage. And it was easy for people to label him an alcoholic, this guy who was perpetually drunk. But I'll submit this to you. Now, when I was writing the book, I would run across people and they would ask me what I was doing. And I would say I was writing a biography of Edgar Allan Poe. And they would get this almost beatific look on their face. And they would say something like, oh,
I'm sorry.
Edgar Allan Poe. No, quite the opposite. They would say, Edgar Allan Poe. I love Edgar Allan Poe. And my lips could almost move with what was going to happen next. They'd say, I've read everything he's written. And I'm thinking, I'd never say it, I'd never challenge it, but in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, no, you haven't. You haven't even begun to read everything he wrote. The first attempt to really put all of Edgar Allan Poe's writing together, a collected edition, was done in the early 1900s. When it was done, the collected writings of Edgar Allan Poe, a man who only lived to be 40, filled 17 volumes.
Wow.
And we have discovered more since. And that much of it is horror. That much of it. And yet it's that much that's defined him. Poe was many kinds of writers. In Poe's lifetime, he wasn't even best known as the author of spooky short stories. He wasn't even best known as a poet. He was primarily known as a literary critic. And a very good one, a very exacting one, and a very feared one. Poe was such an exacting literary critic that his nickname was the Tomahawk Man. He was so exact, but he was good. He was really good. The people he praised, people like Washington Irving and Nathaniel Hawthorne, deserved to be remembered. And the people he went after, we have forgotten. And he was really well ahead of his time as a writer and as a critic. He also was calling for, in his writing as a critic, an American voice. He calls for American literature to break the bonds of Europe. He knew we would never really truly develop a American literature until we got off our knees and stopped bowing down under the long shadow of Europe in general and England in particular. So he calls for a distinct American voice. He's in some ways our John the Baptist from a literary standpoint, out there calling for something. And, the person who's going to answer the call is Mark Twain. Is a few years later, Twain comes along and he writes in the vernacular. He writes a whole entire book where it's narrated by an illiterate 14-year-old boy. And he really sets American literature free. And that's what Poe is kind of calling for in his literature. So Poe is a great literary critic. And our century has reversed the order. We know him first as the author of short stories of horror and mystery, secondarily as a poet, and third, if you know it all, at all, as a literary critic. And that doesn't even begin to calculate uh, the amount of writing Poe did and the various amount of writing. He got from his mother a tremendous work ethic and a tremendous versatility. He inherited that from Eliza Poe, and he was tremendously productive and tremendously versatile as a writer. He would be shocked, he would be stunned to learn that we have made of him sort of our grandfather of God, you know. And if you had said to Poe, you're a horror writer, he wouldn't even know what you were talking about.
Yeah.
Because, you know, no writer who sort of advanced horror in the 1800s. And if you were going to do like a Mount Rushmore of those writers, it would probably start with Mary Shelley, who precedes Poe and has a tremendous influence on both horror and science fiction. So, you know, Mary Shelley with Frankenstein, she's sort of the first one. And then there's Poe. And then there's Robert Louis Stevenson, who gives us Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And then finally, at the end of the century, there's Bram Stoker, who gives us Dracula. That's kind of the Mount Rushmore of the horror type.
Where's Lovecraft? He's in there somewhere, isn't he?
He doesn't come into the next century, though.
Oh, okay.
You know, we're talking about the 19th century right now. But
Yeah.
Lovecraft is a disciple of Poe. Lovecraft will tell you, it would have told you that Poe was his hero.
And
So
this-
not one of them would have known what you would have meant if you could call them a horror writer. They would have said, "Oh, you mean I write Gothic stories?" Well, maybe some days I do. You know, back then writers didn't have to specialize. They didn't have to be branded like the way they are today. Today, that's a 20th century American conceit, where we've taken a writer and we say, "Well, Stephen King is a horror writer," you know, and Raymond Chandler is a mystery writer, and it's like, well, what kind of writer are you? Well, do you have to pick? Do you have to choose? There are types. So, you know, Robert Louis Stevenson would have said, well, today I'm writing Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or The Body Snatcher, but tomorrow I'm writing Treasure Island. And the next day I'm writing A Child's Garden of Verses. And the next day I'm writing essays. They would have not seemed like they would have had to have been defined by that. But we've defined Poe by that small group of stories. And one reason is he was good at it. He was really good at it. So better at than anybody who was doing it at the time.
And the other stuff he wrote, is it pretty accessible now? I mean, how would you look for it? Because it seems like a lot of it just pops up as the horror stuff. I mean, how would you dig for some of that kind of stuff?
Well, you know, there are always collected editions of Poe. There's a wonderful book called The Portable Poe, which is it's always in print.
Check that out.
Edited by J. Gerald Kennedy, and it's got all examples of all different types of writing from different genres that he wrote in. It's got letters, it's got essays, it's got humorous pieces, it's got mystery stories, it's got horror stories, it's got poetry, it's got a little bit of everything in there. So there are some collections out there, and I would start with the Portable Poe, which I think is a wonderful collection.
Is that the Penguin one? The Penguin Classic?
That's right. That's right. It's the Penguin Classic, and it's an excellent example of just how much Poe wrote and how good he was at so many different things.
Did you ever see that American Masters PBS Buried Alive with Dennis O'Hare? Did you get to see that one? That was really good. That's a good one to watch around this time, like every year kind of thing. That was pretty good.
It's okay. There were three major attempts to do documentaries on Poe. The first one was by American Masters back in the 90s. Okay. And then there was one that was done on the A&E biography series. And then there was Buried Alive, second attempt by it. The only problem I have with all three of those is they sort of give lip service to the complete writer and the real writer, and then they play to the stereotype. And they go right back to the stereotype and say, but he was this, gloomy, doomed man who was, and some of that's true. Part of the stereotype is true because aspects of Poe's personality were like that. He dressed in black. He cut a romantic figure. His hero was Lord Byron. And something in him resonated to, the creaking door and the uneasy coffin lid. Something in him resonated to those things and drew him to write those things. But that's only part of who he was. It's like we don't have any trouble accepting Stephen King as a guy who's a devoted family man, a guy who likes to go to baseball games and go root for the Boston Red Sox. We'd have no problem accepting Stephen King as kind of a down-to-earth guy who loves his dog, and at the same time is our reigning master of the horror story. But with Poe, I think a lot of people don't want to accept that there were all these other aspects to his personality. And I think one of the reasons is I think people are a little afraid of losing the fun Poe. And I don't think that's possible. I don't think that's even remotely possible. I'll give you another example of this. If you go back to like 1960, at the dawn of that amazing decade, when everything and the culture seemed to be turned inside out and upside down, and everybody started questioning their place in the world and the culture, and do your own thing, and the dawn of liberation movements. And it's an amazing decade. It really is. And it's such a response to the conformity of the 1950s. If you start at that decade, the two best known American authors around the world are clearly Mark Twain and Edgar Allan Poe. They are the most recognized. They're the best read. And both of their reputations at that point are solidly grounded in stereotype. For Twain, he is the guy in white suit, white hair, white mustache, cigar in hand, dispensing witticisms. He's our grandfatherly man of letters. He's our wit. He is our author of family classics. And that's true. Part of that is who Mark Twain was. But a big part of his writings were being suppressed at that time by his one surviving daughter, Clara, who was absolutely convinced that if these writings ever came out, they would destroy his reputation because they were critical of religion, they were critical of politics, they were critical of what he called the damned human race. But Clara dies in the early 1960s, and these writings start to be published. Now, what happens? It doesn't destroy Twain's reputation, it enlarges it. Twain grows larger throughout the 1960s, and we start to see him as a fierce social critic, a man who had a lot to say on a lot of different subjects, and we better listen to him. So Twain, but we never lose the fun Twain. It's not like we lost that other Twain because we just accepted that he was more than that. Poe comes out of the 1960s, the same guy he went in. He's the guy who gave us the mystery story and the horror story. And that reputation is still pretty much the same today. It hasn't changed. But if we enlarge our view of Poe, we will understand why he was so good at writing those horror stories we love. Just like by understanding Stephen King and knowing that there's a real person behind those stories. That's the real writer. The real writer is not the stereotype with Poe. And you have to accept, it's like Robert Bloch told me, and Robert Bloch was the author of Psycho. He's the creator of Norman Bates. And in his teenage years, Robert Bloch was a pen pal with H.P. Lovecraft. So he's a student of Poe, a friend of Lovecraft, and a master of horror in his own right. And Robert Bloch told me, the problem is nobody thinks of Edgar Allan Poe as somebody whose mother-in-law called him Eddie. And the first time you accept that, you are on the road to accepting the real writer. Once you accept that, you are on the road to destroying the stereotype and the funhouse mirror reflection that we've made of Edgar Allan Poe. So, was he great at this stuff? Yeah, but the reason he was great was not because he was the stereotype, not because he was tinged with insanity. It's because he was a very, very careful writer and a very, very exacting craftsman. And we don't do him any justice if we just say, oh, he was good at this because he was tinged with madness. That undercuts his genius.
How did you get to meet so many cool authors? Was it from writing your books and like interviews, or just them?
I mean, when some of it was an interest, so I would request these interviews. I mean, when somebody would say, who do you want to interview? But there was a lot of opportunity. I spent most of my 43 years in journalism working for newspapers, and most of those years working for newspapers as a TV and film critic.
Cool.
So this put me on the path of interviewing an awful lot of people who did this sort of thing. And
Awesome.
so, in the 1980s, and into the early 90s, I had 4 opportunities to interview Vincent Price, for instance, who
Wow.
loved Poe and gave me some great insights into Poe.
Nice.
So and I would always take advantage of it. If somebody had a new book coming out, if there was somebody like Dean Koontz or Clive Barker had a new book, I would request the interview. And that was back in the day when they would put these people on book tours, and they would come to your city, and you could request an interview with them. So I've written several books, which for lack of a better word, fall on the spooky side of the street. One of my books is on the Night Stalker series with Darren McGavin as Carl Kolchak. One of my books is on Dracula. I edited 3 volumes of works by Richard Matheson, who became a pretty close friend. So
Cool.
for a while, I was working on a book with Ray Bradbury.
Nice.
So, I've been very fortunate. I've been very fortunate in the fact that my paths have crossed with so many of these people.
That's a groovy rap sheet.
Well, and I'm a lucky guy. I'm a very, very lucky.
I still have that Robert Bloch Psycho like hardcover. It has like 3 of them in it. I need to read it. It seems like it gets really creepy. I know I was just seeing Tarantino was saying great. He loves Psycho 2. I thought about digging. I have that.
Psycho 2 is a very good movie. Tom Holland really did a nice job with that. I'm a big fan of Psycho 2 as well.
I want to watch that this time of year for sure.
I think that's got I think a lot of people. I mean, nothing's going to equal the brilliance and the originality of the first movie, but Psycho 2 is a solid effort. Really, really wonderful, solid effort.
I'd like to see it again.
Do either of you guys know what they used for the blood in the original Psycho murder scene?
Was it Hershey syrup?
Hershey's chocolate syrup.
Yeah, that was the go-to thing for blood in westerns and everything because it photographed right in black and white.
Yeah, it has the right consistency. On black and white, you can't tell because there's no color to it. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I definitely want to talk about Poe some more, but on the Kolchak thing, that's just such a great subject that I'm surprised they haven't tried to reboot that on some level. I guess X-Files is kind of maybe an attempt, sort of, but that's just such a great series. And I know there's been a lot of comics and cool things like that with it lately. What was that book about? Just like the history of it, or?
Yeah, what happened was my first book was published in 1982. So, I'm Jurassic. I go back pretty far. My earliest writing, they use carbon-14 to date my earliest writing. So, so my first book was published in 82. It was a slice of theater history, actually. And at that point, people said, like, what's going to be your next book? And I would tell anybody I was going to write the history of my favorite television series of all time, which is The Twilight Zone. And I said, well, I'm going to write a history of The Twilight Zone. And I was living in East Tennessee at the time. I was living and working in East Tennessee, which is not the best place in the world to use as a base of operations for interviewing and building research on the Twilight Zone. But I was young and foolish and, full of confidence. And why not me? Why not? It's my favorite show. Why not? So I did enough interviews to fool myself into thinking I would write that book. 2 of the actors who were at the theater that I had written about in my first book, Fritz Weaver and Claude Akins, had gotten their start at that theater. And then they both were in 2 episodes each of The Twilight Zone. So I had, 2 interviews. And then one day, Donna Douglas, who played Ellie Mae Clampett on the Beverly Hillbillies, came to town to shoot a commercial. And I ran down to the filming site, and she was in a classic Twilight Zone episode, Eye of the Beholder. And so I was doing just enough interviews. And then I walked into a bookstore in 1982, and there it was, Mark Scott Secre's The Twilight Zone Companion. And I bought that book, took it home, and I couldn't even be pissed off about it because Mark had done such a great job in documenting the history of the Twilight Zone. It was a great book. It really was. It in many ways set the standards for books about TV series. And I had to shift my focus. So I shifted it to another favorite series, which was Columbo. Nice. And I did a history of the Columbo series, and I worked on it for about 5 years. That was published in 1989. It was called The Columbo File. And I did, interviewed everybody from Peter Falk on down to the people the guys who created it, all the guest stars and things like that. And my goal was to write as good a book on Columbo as Mark Scott Zicree had written on the Twilight Zone. And then that book was published, and I was just about to make a deal on the next book. And this was like 1989. And a small publisher in New York called me and said he said, I read your Columbo book and I really loved it. And I said, well, thank you. Thank you very much. And he said, have you ever thought about writing a similar book about the Night Stalker? And I said, I love the Night Stalker. I became a journalist because of Carl Kolchak. Carl Kolchak was my hero. I was 15 years old when the first movie, The Night Stalker, aired. And I said, I love the Night Stalker. I love Carl Kolchak. I said, but I didn't think there would be a publisher crazy enough to publish a book like that. And he said, well, I'm crazy enough to publish a book like that. So I said, well, I'll tell you what, if I can get the creator of the character, Jeff Rice, Darren McGavin, Dan Curtis, who produced the original movie, and Richard Matheson, who did the screenplay for the original movie, if I can get those four people to say yes, I'll write the book and then I'll be off to the races. Well, all four of them signed on right away for it. And that book was published in 1991 as Night Stalking. And a couple years later, another small publisher got the rights to do Kolchak fiction from Jeff Rice, the creator, because Jeff had owned the literary rights to the character. And Jeff wasn't interested at that moment of writing what would have been the third Kolchak. He wrote the original two Kolchak novels, The Night Stalker, The Night Strangler. And the publisher said, well, would you let somebody else write him? He said, yes, I'd let Mark write because I like what he did with the nonfiction book. So my next Kolchak book was actually a novel called Grave Secrets.
Cool.
Which was a horror novel featuring Carl Kolchak 20 years later. It was the first original Kolchak fiction in 20 years when that was published in 94. Then in 97, I published a revised edition of the Night Stalking as the Night Stalker Companion. And then in the early 2000s, I published a collection of Richard Matheson's Kolchak scripts that had the Night Stalker and the Night Strangler and the unfilmed third movie, what was going to be the third movie, The Night Killers. And then I've written Kolchak comic book scripts, short stories, and novellas. I think I've written just about anything you can write as far as Kolchak. I've spent an awful lot of time in Carl Kolchak's company over the years, and it's a big part of the resume. But I was always very grateful to Carl Kolchak for a lot of things. First off, because, like I said, I became a journalist because he was my hero and my role model. I started college in September of 1974 at George Washington University, which is located just a few blocks away from the White House and Washington, D.C. And the same month that I started my work towards a journalism degree at George Washington was the same month that on Friday the 13th, today is Friday the 13th.
Yeah.
Friday the 13th, September 1974, Kolchak the Night Stalker premiered as a series. So, it was just like perfect. I'd seen the other two movies, and just as I was starting my work towards a journalism degree, here comes the series that lasted 20 episodes, one season in 1974-75. Now, what you have to know is that in September of 1974, that was just weeks after Richard Nixon had resigned the presidency due to the Watergate scandal.
Yeah.
Oh, I was surrounded by students who wanted to be Woodward and Bernstein. They wanted to be, this was why journalism. I wanted to be Carl Kolchak. From the beginning, he was my role model as to what a real journalist was, a real reporter was. And I have since met a lot of other journalists who have said the same thing. That so then I'm grateful to Carl again, because in 1989, when the Columbo book was published, the next book was going to be another mystery book, another mystery topic. If I had done that book, it might have set me forever as kind of a mystery guy, more of a mystery guy than anything else. But Kolchak pushed me back into the thing that I first loved, which was the horror stuff. And it gave me enough cred to then go do stuff like horror fiction and the Dracula book and things like that. And then in 2017, I got a chance to do my Twilight Zone book. I waited all those years, and I finally got my Twilight Zone book, which was published in 2017. It's called Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone. It's a tribute to the parables and the morality lessons of the Twilight Zone. And I finally got my Twilight Zone book, but I wouldn't have gotten the Twilight Zone book if Carl Kolchak hadn't pushed me back in that right direction, and that created a path that led to the Twilight Zone book in 2017. So you never know how life's going to work out. You never know how this is going to go. And, you think you're the captain of your ship. You think you're making all the decisions. Then you step back and you see fate pushed you.
Synchronicity.
In certain places where you were meant to be at certain times. And again, if it wasn't for that, I was pushed back into the direction which gave me finally my Twilight Zone book. And if it hadn't been for the Twilight Zone book, I would, because that was published by St. Martin's in 2017, I wouldn't have then done the Poe book, because that was done by St. Martin's, and it was my follow-up book for them. So cool. I owe Carl Kolchak a lot.
And what I was going to ask, when it comes to Kolchak, it's been a while since I've watched it, but what was some of the things in it? Was it paranormal phenomenon that was actually real, or I'm trying to remember? It's been a while since I've seen it.
The first movie aired in January of 1972, and the commercials for it began in October of 71. ABC's ad campaign for this movie was just spectacular. But you couldn't tell from the commercials whether, you knew it was about a vampire, but you didn't know whether it was a real vampire or just a serial killer who thought he was a vampire. You didn't know until you actually saw the movie how it was going to play out. And they didn't cop out, it's a real vampire. And it's an amazing movie. It's a movie that still holds up to this day, because one of the great things about The Night Stalker is it's set in Las Vegas. It's not only set in an American town, it's set in the American town, in Sin City, baby. And it's so logical. I mean, if you were a vampire, where would you go? How about to a city that's on your schedule, that's up all night, and it's full of transients, full of people who come and go, will never be missed? For a vampire, Las Vegas is a smorgasbord. It's a place where you'll fit in. Nobody will notice you. It's a great place to be a predator. And so The Night Stalker was such an original idea, an original concept. They then did a second movie set in Seattle called The Night Strangler. And then the series was 20 episodes. Each there was a monster of the week. It was a vampire, a zombie, an Aztec mummy, a witch, a werewolf, alien. So every week the paranormal threat was different, but it was real. It was very much real. So that was Kolchak, the 2 movies and the 20 episodes. And when I published the book in 91, that's all there had been. That's all there was. And then the 2 novels that Jeff Rice wrote, that was pretty much the entire Kolchak universe. But one thing happened between the 2 versions of the book, the 91 version, 97 version, is that the X-Files premiered.
Yes.
And Chris Carter, who created the X-Files, would tell anybody who would listen to him, to this day will say the same thing, that the reason he created the X-Files was because as a kid, the Night Stalker had scared the piss out of him. So a whole generation, everybody who goes on to create horror in the 90s, you have to sort of wait. The Night Stalker is 72, and then like 20 years later, just like clockwork, all these great horror people who were influenced by the movie, who were influenced by this film. So you get things like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the X-Files, Supernatural, Grimm. All these things are by people who acknowledge that the Night Stalker and the Carl Kolchak character had this enormous influence on them. So,
hey, Mark, you ever heard of a guy named Dr. Richard Allen Miller? That he says he has a connection to X-Files, that they based it on him and stuff. He's like a scientist, and he goes around. He's been on Richard Allen Miller, but he was on, and somehow he has some connection to X-Files. That's weird, but I don't know if it's true or not. But I know he's been on a lot of shows saying it on the circuit and stuff. But I was just curious if you'd heard of him. I don't know if it's true or not, but For all I know, no telling. But anyway, the Kolchak thing's really cool, and I knew it had influenced X-Files and everything. I'm surprised they haven't tried to reboot Kolchak. Give
They
it
did.
time.
They did.
How
2005.
so?
There
What
was
was
a
that?
2000. There was a 2005 series, The Night Stalker, with Stuart Townsend as Carl Kolchak. They made it much
Look it up.
younger. They gave it sort of a X-Files type of
2005.
mythology. It did not last long. It only lasted a few weeks, like 8 weeks on ABC in 2005.
Oh, okay. I
So
see
there
it.
was an attempt. There was an attempt to revive it. It was somewhat misguided. There was a lot of micromanaging by ABC that ruined the whole idea of how to do it correctly, and it was quickly and deservedly canceled. But Kolchak has gone on in comic books and short stories. Moonstone, a Chicago operation, had got the rights from Jeff Rice in the early 2000s to do original stories. And they have now done dozens upon dozens of new Kolchak stories over the years. So Kolchak goes on. He has this amazing influence. The original movie, though, I mean, you cannot underestimate its influence, because the original movie, I used to show it. I did a class, a film appreciation class at Kent State University for 10 years. And I would show The Night Stalker. When we got to the 70s, I would show The Night Stalker. And not one of my students had ever heard of it. I would say The Night Stalker, Carl Kolchak, and it was blank stares. Even a lot of these students who said, oh, we've seen everything. We've seen all the horror stuff that's out there, all the vampire stuff. And I'd say Night Stalker, and it's, what? And I'd say, this is the best known unknown vampire story of all time. And what I meant by that was they didn't know it, but they knew all the things that it influenced. They said they knew and had seen all this other stuff that had been influenced by Night Stalker. But when Night Stalker aired, it set the ratings record for a TV movie when it aired in 1972. It got a 33.4 rating. Now, back then, Nielsen broke down ratings by what was called a rating and a share. The rating was the percentage of total TV households, because advertisers sold based on households, who's in the household. So they wanted a household rating. So the 33.4 rating is much higher than 1/3 of the country was watching this movie, because most households have more than one person in it, right? So, ergo, way more than 1/3 of the country was watching this movie. And then there's the share. The share is what was the percentage of the audience actually watching television, the total audience watching television at that time that was watching your show. Because not everybody's watching television at the same time, right? You might be out, you might be bowling, you might be out for dinner. Who knows? That number, The Night Stalker got a 54 share, which means more than 1 out of 2 people watching television during the time that it aired was watching The Night Stalker.
Cool.
And the reason it was so good was because The Night Stalker was very sly. It blended like 3 very distinct forms, which shouldn't have gone together. One was a traditional horror story, because at the base, The Night Stalker was a traditional Dracula horror story. It's about a vampire invading a major city. Well, that's Dracula. So it's at its core, it's a very old-fashioned horror story, and it owes a lot to Bram Stoker. Secondarily, it works as a newspaper comedy, because the conceit is that the hero is a newspaper man, a hard-charging newspaper man who always has got a wisecrack for every occasion. This hard-charging guy who's always got his hat ready to go on and bolt out the door, and is always having arguments with his editor. And you see this in every 1930s newspaper movie. It's always a reporter played by Clark Gable or Frederick March, and he's always, cut the gab and get me, sweetheart, get me rewrite, sweetheart type of guy, And so this was also kind of a throwback. It was kind of a throwback to this kind of earlier hard-charging newspaper comedy type of thing that was very popular in the 1930s. And then third, it was almost like a film noir. It was almost because Kolchak operated like a detective. And Darren McGavin, who played the part, had played Mike Hammer in the syndicated Mickey Spillane series in the 50s, and then he played the lead detective character in a series called The Outsider. He'd been known for playing this kind of hard-charging detective type. And The Night Stalker works as sort of a film noir mystery too. The only thing is that the mystery is supernatural. The killer is a vampire, and the mystery is supernatural. Otherwise, all the story steps are almost like film noir cinema verite type of thing. So you take these three things and you put it together. And those three things should not go together, but they do. They go together brilliantly in that original movie. And it meant that you didn't have to be a horror fan to love this movie. There were a lot of points of access to this movie. You could be like you loved old newspaper movies, you loved detective stories. It works on all three levels. Works brilliantly on all three levels. So it's a very fly piece of entertainment. It really is.
Definitely. And what was some of the Dracula book? Was it just like the history of Dracula and Bram Stoker and things like that? Or did you get
It
the
is
Vlad
very
the
much about
Impaler?
it's very much about the book and everything that the book spawned. It was part of a series. There was a company called Continuum, and they had done a book called the Bedside Bathtub and Armchair Companion to Agatha Christie, and it became their best-selling title in the history of this publisher. So they decided, well, we'll try it again. So they did a second book called The Bedside Bathtub and Armchair Companion to Sherlock Holmes, and that was a big hit for them. So then they decided to franchise it out and do various topics, very popular topics. And they came to me and said, would you like to write the Bedside Bathtub and Armchair Companion to Dracula? And I said, yeah, I'd love to do that. And it gave me a chance to really dig deep into the Dracula research. I got into the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia and spent several days with all of Bram Stoker's notes that all of Stoker's Dracula notes are at the Rosenbach. And they really tell the tale of how Stoker wrote that book, that amazing book. And so the book is about Stoker. It is about the writing of the book and everything that went into that amazing book, and then everything that the book spawned, the movies, the TV adaptations, and all of that. So
How heavily was the Vlad the Impaler thing? Did you find any Vlad the Impaler secrets or anything like that? Did you get into that a lot or just a
the
little?
main thing that's clear is, this is always a debate among Dracula fans and scholars. It's clear that Bram Stoker knew extremely little about Vlad the Impaler. In fact, it's probably true he didn't even know that that his name was Vlad. Stoker never went to Transylvania. He never actually stepped foot on Transylvania soil. He once said, well, a tree is a tree, and you can describe it. He did all of his research at the British Museum, and he got most of his Transylvania stuff out of a book about a travel book about Transylvania. And one of the things he got out of that book, a lot of nonsense worked into it, but it's become part of the established lore. Well, one of the books he got told him that the word Nosferatu meant undead. In fact, the word doesn't exist. The word Nosferatu has never been found in any language. If somebody wants to make their reputation, find a derivation for Nosferatu, because as a word, it does not exist in Romanian. It does not exist in Greek. It does not exist in Latin. It does not exist in Russian. And Stoker bought this. He's had Van Helsing tell the other vampire fighters that we are dealing with Nosferatu, the undead. And indeed, that word does not really exist.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Well, the closest we've got to it is there's a Greek word, Nosphoros. And
Okay.
Nosphoros means plague carrier. If you look at the interpretation of the character in the movie Nosferatu in 1922, it is metaphorically a plague carrier. That would be very fitting if that was where the word came from. It's a good guess that it comes from Nosphoros. But Stoker knew that there was a warlord who ruled not Transylvania, but Wallachia. And he knew that there was a warlord that used the name Dracula and fought the Turks. If he knew much more than that, I would be surprised. Now, that does work in and shape the character of Dracula. If you want to say that it was based on Vlad the Impaler, that seems pretty a pretty strong claim.
Yeah.
But the fact that he does use that, he does have, he does have Dracula boast about fighting the Turks and driving back the Turks, and the proud voivode line, meaning warlord. So he does borrow things from the character of Vlad the Impaler, but he knew very little about Vlad. And what he did know came from German and Russian pamphlets, which depicted Vlad as a bloodthirsty, tyrant.
The woodcutting one picture and
Right,
all that.
exactly.
Yeah.
That's what he would have gotten the propaganda version of Vlad the Impaler, not the homegrown version of Vlad the Impaler, in which he is a national hero in
Yes.
Romania. So, even if Stoker knew anything, he would have been getting a very skewed account of Vlad. But he does get important things from Vlad, not the least of which is the name. I mean, you cannot undercut, because remember, Stoker was going to title the book The Undead or Count Undead at one point. I mean, can you imagine?
Yeah.
Would we still be reading this book? He not only gets the name of his vampire from Vlad, he gets the title of his book. And the title is amazing. I mean, Dracula. My goodness, that sounds like a whip crack coming through history. Dracula. That sound is Stoker was a man of the theater. Why does he set the story in Transylvania when Vlad didn't rule Transylvania? The name. He loved the name. How much better does Transylvania sound? It sounds mysterious. It sounds, today, Transylvania, you sound Transylvania and you've got this whole idea of moats and castles and ruined landscapes and dead trees. And Transylvania means the land beyond the forest. That's the literal translation. And most of Transylvania looks like the opening of The Sound of Music. It's a beautiful, beautiful Carpathian mountains. It's gorgeous. And most people think of it as like the Munsters now, because that's the Transylvania of our imagination, and it's the Transylvania that Bram Stoker gave. And he did a lot of research, though, and that's the amazing thing about that book. It's just how much research Stoker did, to the point that you pretty much can take the same path that Jonathan Harker takes to the castle. Eat the same food, the same timetable, stay in the same villages. He did all that research about, how you would travel right onto the Borgo Pass. And yeah, there's a Borgo Pass right where he says it is. There's no castle beyond that, because Dracula's castle would have been way to the south in what in current day Romania. But there's the fictional castle is located near the Borgo Pass. So, it is he does get important things from Vlad, no question. Definitely. But how much he actually knew of Vlad and Vlad's history, probably very little.
Seemed like he did it kind of nonchalantly, like not with much, not much care, just kind of. Ooh.
I think when he hit that name, when he was doing his research, and he saw that there was a warlord named Dracula, he knew he had it. He knew he had the title of his character and the title of his book. Because again, Stoker in his lifetime, like Poe was not best known in his lifetime as the spinner of horror stories, Stoker was not best known as a writer. He was best known as the manager of the Lyceum Theatre in London, the home theater of Sir Henry Irving, the leading Shakespearean actor of his day. And the difference between Bram Stoker and Edgar Allan Poe, or Bram Stoker and practically every other great horror writer, is Bram Stoker is pretty much a one-hit wonder. I mean, Bram Stoker wrote 18 books, and the average person would be hard-pressed to name one more. Now some people who are real vampire fans or horror fans will say, "Oh, I know Lair of the White Worm, or Lady Shroud, or one of those." But none of those books come up to Dracula. He wrote one book that was bigger than himself. He wrote one book that was better and bigger than anything else he ever wrote. There's nothing that he wrote other than Dracula that comes anywhere close to it. And it's not like a Charles Dickens. You say Charles Dickens, he wrote Oliver Twist. Yeah, what else did he write? Whoa, Christmas Carol, David Copperfield, Telltale Cities, Great Expectations. Mark Twain, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, Life on the Mississippi, Connecticut Yankee, King Arthur's Court, Prince and the Pauper, Bram Stoker, Dracula.
What was that Dracula's Guest book or something like that? Is that
It,
something that he wrote that's like a spinoff or something?
it's actually, it was the last thing he was working on. He was working on a collection of short stories as he was dying. And, the thing about Bram Stoker was that Stoker died in April of 1912. In fact, the last thing he probably heard was that the Titanic had struck an iceberg and gone to the bottom of the North Atlantic.
Mm.
So he dies right, around the same time the Titanic goes down. And he's working on this last book, which is going to be a collection of short stories. And he uses a story, the lead story, Dracula's Guest, which was originally going to be part of the Dracula book. It was an excise thing that about Jonathan Harker's trip to the before he gets to Transylvania. And so it becomes the lead story and the title of that book, which is Dracula's Guest and Other Stories. So it's a
Cool.
short story, basically.
I've never read that one. I'll have to check it out.
It's very
And,
good. It's very atmospheric. It's
I'll have to grab it. I
extraordinary.
don't even think I have it, unless it may be in a book that I have, like has a Dracula. Might have it included or something. Jay, was there anything you wanted to talk about, or what were you going to say, Mark?
No, I'm just going to say, if you take Dracula's Guest and the end of the book, there seems to be some indication that at some point Stoker might have been thinking about a sequel, because Dracula ends, the book ends on sort of a note of like he was going to have the castle destroyed at the end of the book, and then he just changed his mind. He decided, no, let's leave the castle, and it's almost like he's thinking sequel. He never
Part two
did.
going up. Well, one thing I wanted to touch on was you said early on that just before Poe's death, he went missing for 6 days, and then he's found like inconsolable in the middle of Baltimore. How long after that does he die?
Oh, just days later. I mean,
Just days.
He discovered October 3rd on the streets of Baltimore, and he dies October 7th. So they take him. He's found outside. There was an election. It was election day when Poe was found, and they found him outside a polling place, which was also an inn and had a tavern inside. So they dragged him inside this polling place and sent for a couple people who knew him. They showed up and realized he's in bad shape and that the best thing will be to send him to a hospital in the area. So they transport him to the hospital, and he's there for just a few days lingering. And he dies on a Sunday morning, October 7th. So, and again, the problem with Poe's death is when this book came about, and I was talking to St. Martin's about, it wasn't my idea to write a biography of Edgar Allan Poe. I should cop to that immediately. When a book is done, when you write a book for a mainstream publisher, there is a clause in your contract, which is called the option clause. It gives them the option to publish your next book. They don't have to publish it, but you need to offer them the next book. So I had done a Twilight Zone book for St. Martin's, and it had done well enough for us to have that conversation. So in the fall of 2019, I said, I had a conversation with an editor at St. Martin's, and I hit this editor with what I thought was my best can't miss, super slick idea. And the problem was it missed badly. He was not at all interested in my can't miss idea. And he counter proposed with an idea, and I didn't like his idea. And we went back and forth like that for a while. And then we kind of realized that we better table this conversation for another day. And just as we were getting off the phone, he said, "What about Edgar Allan Poe?" And I said, "Well, what about him?" And he said, "Well, it seems it's been a while since we've had a major biography of Edgar Allan Poe." I said, "No, that doesn't seem right. Didn't we just have a couple?" Well, I was thinking the 1990s was the last time there had been a couple. So I said, "Yeah, I guess it had been a little while. It has been about maybe 20 years or more." And I said, "But why me?" And he said, "Well, I think Poe checks a lot of your boxes." And I said, and then sometimes it takes somebody else to point out the obvious.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Well, how do you figure?" And he said, "Well, Poe is the father of the modern horror story. You've written about landmark horror topics like Dracula and the Night Stalker. Poe is the father of the modern detective story. You've written a book about a great detective character with Columbo. Poe is a critic most of his life. You were a critic most of your life. Poe was a major 19th century American author. 5 of your books are about a major 19th century author, Mark Twain. How does this not check all your boxes? And I thought, well, I guess that's right. But then it came down to the type of book he wanted. And it became very clear very quickly. He wanted the type of book that seems to get published every 2 years that purports to definitively solve the identity of the Jack the Ripper mystery. I don't know how many of these books we've had so far, but we're probably up to about 17 definitive suspects as who Jack the Ripper was. Well, he wanted the exact same type of book, I think, that would purport to definitively solve the mystery of Poe's death. And I told him, if that's the book you want, my advice to you is to go find yourself another lunatic, because this one's driving away right now. Let me tell you why that book could not be published. A, there was no death certificate. B, there was no autopsy. And even if there had been an autopsy, it would have been worthless, beyond worthless, because the state of the autopsy in 1849 was primitive. The modern autopsy comes about during the Civil War. That's when we got very good at cutting up and dissecting bodies, and we knew what to look for. Before that, it's a very spotty art. And even if there had been an autopsy, it would have been conducted with the equivalent of butcher's knives and machetes. It would be worthless. So there's no death certificate, no autopsy. There's no surviving soft tissue that can be subjected to modern forensics. And the only witnesses to Poe's death are not only unreliable, they contradict each other and they contradict themselves, including the attending physician, John Moran, who leaves 3 accounts of Poe's death. They are wildly different in details and tone, and he goes so far as to change the time of death and Poe's last words. So if this guy was on the witness stand, any lawyer would tear this guy to shreds. So for all of these reasons, it's a cold case. And then I told this editor, but I tell you the book I will write you. I'm much more interested in how Poe lived than how he died. So I will write you a book that examines his life through the filter of the mystery of his death. So there are alternating chapters in this book, an alternating timeline. The book bounces between the last 4 months of Poe's life and then flashbacks to the different times of his life that takes chronologically until the 2 timelines meet at the end. And I told the guy, if I come up with a theory as to how I think Poe died, and I think it is convincing, compelling, and logical, I will present it as such. I will not say I can prove it. I will not go that far. That's irresponsible. So do I have a theory as to how Poe died? Yes. Do I think it's the answer? Yes. Do I insist on it? No. If you choose to believe it's rabies or a brain tumor or murder or whatever, be my guest. I think part of the allure of Poe is that there is this mystery that surrounds his death. And the bigger part of me wishes it'll never be solved, because we will lose something. We will lose something immense if we ever were able to solve it definitively. There is a great romanticism to not knowing, to thinking that Poe beat us all, left us with a mystery that we can't solve. I like that idea. There's an old saying that there are some mysteries that are not meant to be solved, and I think this is one.
Yeah, this is one of them. So do you think that whatever it was that culminated in his death is in those 6 days that are missing? That's what
Part of it is. I think part of it is, you see, I took a lot of chances with this book. Now, one of the chances I took with the alternating timelines, because most biographies are written chronologically, A to Z, birth to death. So the alternating timeline was taking a chance, but Poe took chances, and I figured there are a lot of biographies of Poe that take him through his life A to Z. Let's try something different. The other thing I did was I did interviews for the book. Well, how do you do interviews for somebody who died in 1849? There's nobody alive who knew Edgar Allan Poe. There's nobody alive who knew anybody who knew Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah.
But I was a journalist for 43 years, and I can't pretend to be a different kind of writer. I can't pretend to be some kind of academic or some kind of scholarly writer writing a scholarly biography. I'm a popular writer who writes to be read, as was Poe. And I was a journalist, and I was going to use the tools that I had. So I did interviews, and the people I interviewed were Poe scholars, people who spent a lifetime studying minute aspects of Poe's life and his writing, um, forensic pathologists, people who spend their lives doing autopsies, forensic archaeologists, medical historians. I have an FBI agent who agreed to examine this, detectives, true crime writers. These were my witnesses. These were the people I looked at, and I encouraged all of them not to talk like scholars, not to talk like professionals, to say it the way you would just say it. Don't talk like you're talking to another academic or like you're trying to write to another academic. Talk to me like you would say it just as a normal. And out of this came gold. Out of this process came just wonderful gold. And I love the interviews in the book. And that is not common for a biography, to have those kinds of, almost like a documentarian would do it, like a Ken Burns, where you would show something, you have the narrator telling you, then you have an expert appear on camera saying, well, the thing you need to know about this. So I took a lot of chances. And when you take chances like that, it's sort of like jumping off a very high diving board. And on your way down, you just hope there's water in the pool when you get there. You know, you're not sure, but you just have to have a lot of faith that when you get down there, there's going to be a splash. So, but it's the only way I could have written the book. Like I said, you can't pretend to be a different kind of writer. You can't pretend to be something you're not. It's a very good way to write a bad book, and certainly not one true to yourself. So I did take those chances, and then I acted as a detective on a case, and I treated every known theory about how Poe died as a suspect. And I treated this as a detective, and I treated my witnesses, my experts, as witnesses to all this, and asked them, what do you think? Now, along the way, I could discount a lot of the existing theories about Poe. It's like I start with maybe 25 suspects, and then I say, no, no, no. And as a detective, you always keep going back to what's called the primary person of interest. Who is the one suspect in all of this that had the most means and the most opportunity? Is there one in Poe's life that fits that description? I believe there is. That does not mean that that primary suspect did not have accomplices. Alcohol. Alcohol's got to be viewed as an accomplice. Did it kill him? I don't think so. But did it weaken his system? I think it did. The devastating effects on drinking, which we talked about before, were so extreme that it probably set him up for something else. It probably weakened his system to the point that it laid him open to something else. Certainly poverty, the fact that he never had money and he was always battling poverty his entire life. Certainly that is an accomplice to undermine his health and things like this. So there are accomplices too. So you have your primary suspect, and then you have your accomplices. Do I believe I know who the primary suspect, who are the primary person of interest is? Yes. Do I think there are accomplices? Yes. And are there things that I think can be discounted out of hand? Yes. One, for instance, a few years ago, a popular theory went around that Poe died a victim of rabies. But you see, one of the problems with figuring out how Edgar Allan Poe died is that Poe died under what a forensic pathologist would call non-specific symptoms. Non-specific symptoms mean that any number of things could cause them. And what we know of how Poe died, there's a staggering number of things that could have caused them. We know that he was feverish. We know that he was raving. We know that there was some inflammation of the brain, what they used to call brain fever back then. A lot of things can cause that. A staggering number of things can cause that. So you could take any one of your pet theories and sort of bend those symptoms around your theory and say, aha, that must be what killed Edgar Allan Poe. So rabies went around because can rabies cause all those things? Yeah, sure. But here's one other thing that rabies causes an aversion to water. You can't drink liquids if you are dying of rabies. You develop hydrophobia. You will actually foam at the mouth at the very idea of swallowing water if you're dying of rabies. Poe is in the hospital for 3 days. It's clear he took water, bouillon, liquids. There's no record of him not being able to have liquids, and there's no way he was in the hospital for 3 days and not have been given liquids. If he swallowed one drop of water, it wasn't rabies. So we can take rabies off the list. Suspect out. Go home.
Sounds a lot like a blow to the head.
Well, not so much a blow to the head because that would not have caused some of the other symptoms that were there. And had there been any physical damage, because one of the theories that came up in the 1990s was that Poe was murdered and that he was murdered by the brothers of his fiancée at that point, Elmira Royster in Richmond, that they tracked him down and beat him to within an inch of his life, and that those inadvertently led to his death. So this was a theory that was put forth in a book by a writer named John Evangelist Walsh. The problem with that theory is there's no evidence that the brothers felt that strongly. There's no evidence that they followed Poe. And Poe, when he was admitted to the hospital, the first thing they did was examine his body. If there had been wounds like that, any kind of bruisings, any kind of blow to the head, anything like that, it would have been noted. They weren't that primitive. They was in the hospital and his body was thoroughly examined. So if there was that kind of blunt force trauma to the body at that point, it undoubtedly would have been noted at some point. So I discount the murder theory as well. I think the murder theory is as entertaining as it is, does not hold water.
Death by misadventure.
Well, one of the theories there's two mysteries, remember here. There's a mystery of what killed him, and then there's the mystery of the missing days. Where was he?
Yeah.
For those days, what was he doing? Part of the theory that's been put forth. One of the curious things about Poe, and any detective will tell you this. If there's something that's odd that stands out, don't discount it. Never, ever, ever discount that one thing that sort of grabs your attention. Well, here's the one thing that sort of grabs your attention about Poe when he was found. He was found in ill-fitting clothes that were not his own. Now, you keep coming back to that one. He's found in clothes that were not his own. Well, there was an election going on. And there used to be this thing called, now Baltimore was a rough town back then.
Baltimore, it's a rough town now.
Well, by any town in the 1800s, any American town on the eastern seaboard would have had a port and a harbor district, and the harbor district would have been a rough district, So, but even by those standards, Baltimore was a really hard, rough town. Its nickname was Mob Town. And the reason it was nicknamed Mob Town is that these people would riot at the drop of a hat. And they took their rioting very seriously. These people rioted every few years like clockwork. And when they rioted, they would drive the mayor and the sheriff out of town. They would burn down the homes of the leading, citizens. The militia would have to come in, and the army would have to come in to restore order. It took days to restore order. So Baltimore's a rough town, even by those days' standards. If he gets to Baltimore, and there's an election going on. Now, there was this thing back then called cooping. And cooping was these roving bands of these political parties would kidnap people off the streets. And then they would take them from precinct to precinct, making them vote, repeat voters, for their candidate. And then in between stops at polling places, they would keep them penned up or cooped up, if you would. And so the term became cooping. And in between, they might make you change clothes so you'd have less chance of being recognized as you went from polling place to polling place. Now, that's a very good explanation as to why Poe might have gone missing for at least a couple of days. And it's also a very good explanation as to why he was wearing clothes that weren't his own. And why he might have been, if his health was off the track, being kept in these coops. If he was already sick, this would have been very detrimental to his health. So if he gets
Yeah,
kidnapped,
and well, he could have also suffered other injuries in like those early days before he got to the hospital, where if there was a blow to the head, maybe the bruise and swelling had gone down and they couldn't detect it, or maybe they hit him so hard in the stomach they burst a spleen or a liver or something. It's just because we didn't have any invasive technologies. They didn't have X-rays back then. They didn't even have the
no,
radio. So
no, but
there's-
they did they know how to examine a body. They did know
yeah,
how to go top to bottom. From the nursing staff and the doctors there did did very well. But there's some very serious internal things going on with his nervous system. Not so much with his circulatory system, but with his nervous system. Because remember, it's the brain inflammation that's kind of the key thing that you keep going back to. That's a telltale thing that he's suffering from something that has inflamed the membranes it's inside his skull, and that that usually is not the effect of blunt force trauma unless there's swelling of some kind, and this does not indicate sort of the kind of swelling that leads to a coma or something like that. That usually comes with a brain fracture or something like that. And there's no indication. The skull was actually examined when they dug him up in 1875, and it was in good shape. So, probably not is what it comes down to. But whatever it is that killed him, if Poe was sick when he got to Baltimore, and he goes missing and gets kidnapped on the streets of some place called Mobtown, this would be very bad for his health. This would be very, very,
yeah,
very. He's probably at that point a dead man the moment they find him. And he was a dead man by the moment they find him. It just took him days to die. But you know, but again, you can go round and round about this, and I have, and I said, like I said, I've got all of the medical opinion of, because I'm certainly I'm no forensic expert, I'm no medical expert, but I went to the ones who were and had them examine the case and got their opinion on things and got their, and when you come down to it, you're still dealing with a mystery. You're still dealing with
yeah,
something that, again, even with the best theory you've got, you can't prove it. You cannot prove it. And, even if we were, the only thing that would ever prove it, as one Poe scholar said, maybe if we dug Poe up and found a hatchet sticking out of his back, we might have this solved. But, short of that, what's going to prove it?
yeah.
Even if you tested the bones, and then which is all that's going to be left at this point, even if those were subjected, there's only so much that will tell you. There's only so much that can tell you. The bones actually might tell you if he had certain diseases. They do leave traces. We've treated Egyptian mummies and found, traces of different diseases in Egyptian mummies. They tell us they had the disease. They don't tell us whether they died of the disease.
Right. Yeah.
That's
Well, hey guys, we got 1 minute left, so it's going by fast. It's been amazing.
Oh,
What a
wow,
great
yeah.
show for the season. My favorite season. I start in September, or every day is Halloween ministry type situation. But what is what's your website, Mark, and the best place to get the book?
Oh, well, the best place to get the book is any bookstore near you, because it's available through any BAM, Barnes and Noble. You can get it through Amazon. And my website, it's always very tricky. It's just my name.com, markdawidziak.com. That'll take you to my website. I'm also on Facebook. I'm one of the easiest people in the world to find. So, and I try to make it so. So, always, and these are all topics I love talking about, obviously.
Do you look like Mark Twain? Why does that cross my mind? I mean, there's things
I
I
play
look
Mark Twain. If it it doesn't take much for me to get there. I started playing Mark Twain 45 years ago when I was 22. And back when I was 22, It took me 2 hours to look like this. I actually had to do the whole Lon Chaney thing with the makeup box and sit, and the mustache was fake back then, and spray the hair, or do the eyebrows and everything, and paint in the lines. And that makeup process got shorter and shorter each year.
Yeah.
So pretty much down to pick up the white suit, pick up the cigar and go. And I love the people who ask me, "Are you doing this on purpose?" And I would say, "Yes, I went back in time, had myself arranged DNA so I would look like Mark Twain when I was 67. No, I'm not doing this on purpose. It happened.
I look like Uncle Fester if I take this off. So. but did you ever see that claymation, The Adventures of Mark Twain?
I
That's so
wrote
good.
a whole paper about that. I
Great.
interviewed Will Vinton, and
I love that.
I did a paper for a Mark Twain conference.
That's great stoner stuff for sure.
The thing is, they marketed it as a children's movie.
Yeah, it's weird.
And
that
it's
devil
dark as
scene
all
and
get
stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy. But we appreciate it so much, Mark, and definitely keep us in the loop on future projects. And thanks so much.
All right, no, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it, guys.
Yep.
Happy
Thanks, Mark.
Halloween. I had to watch
Same to you.
Creep Show season 4 started on Shudder. The Creep. Remember Stephen King Meteor shit?
I love that movie. Hal Holbrook was one of my best friends.
Have you seen the series? There's a series.
Oh
now.
yeah, Greg Nicotero. Yeah, I've interviewed Greg several times.
Nice. I love it. The new season start tonight, so I got to get on that. All right, everybody. Y'all have a good weekend. Take care.
Right.
United Public Radio 107.7 FM New Orleans, and happy Halloween. Next week is Stephen Flowers, Gothic Meditations at Midnight. He's going to break down occult symbolism and Nosferatu, Phantom of the Opera, and all kinds of weirdness with Stephen Flowers. Take care, everybody.